correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to Me and Steve Talk RPGs, a podcast where me and my friend Steve try and help you get the most out of your role-playing game experience.
Welcome back to Me and Steve Talk RPGs. I'm here with my host, Steve. What's up,
Hey,
Steve? And what is up, Gamer Nation? So, before we get going, let's shout out our podcast for the week. This is one of my favorite podcasts on the D20 Network. We have the Staggering Dragon.
Ah, yes.
You want to talk about the Staggering Dragon a little bit, Steve?
Sure. So the Staggering Dragon is a bunch of friends that just get together and play RPGs. And to this point, they usually do actual plays. And to this point, they've used either Star Wars or Genesis. But they did a G.I. Joe actual play that was absolutely hysterical. And while I'm often not one for comedy actual plays, like they're not necessarily doing comedy so much as they're just funny. I don't know how else to explain it.
You can tell that it's a great group of people and they really just get along and are funny. And honestly, I'm really enjoying their Star Wars RPG or their Star Wars playthrough, and it's a really good time with that one as well.
Yeah, and there's some, what do you want to say, some zany elements to that, but they're all actually really good role players too.
Oh yeah, fantastic. And Staggering Dragon, again, when I say it, I mean it's one of my favorite RPG or one of my favorite podcasts, one of my favorite RPGs. Yeah, I'm all there today. No, it's one of my favorite podcasts, and it's one of my favorite podcasts on our network. And yeah, I really like that show and really like what they put out, and they put out some really quality content. So
Yes.
well, with that, and talking about players and good players, bad players, and everything in between, you want to get into our topic for the week?
Sure.
So our topic for the week is player buy-in.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to do a little bit of quick defining before we get started into too crazy what we would mean when we say buy-in.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting you say that because, sometimes I actually try to do some research on our topics. Not that often, but occasionally I do. And so I had a minute this afternoon and I went to try and look and see if anybody else, like on YouTube had done a video about buy-in, be it, Seth Skorkowski or how to be a great GM or, I mean, there's tons of RPG videos out, right? I couldn't find a single one. So I put it into just regular old Google search and I came up with one blog article from 2008. And it struck me as odd because it's something, I mean, you hear it talked about all the time, and it's a term that, even we've thrown it around here on the show. But then I started thinking, I'm like, well, how would you define it? And the article that I found is actually by a guy named Martin. I'm going to butcher this last name, but I'm going to say Ralya, Ralya. But it's from 2008 and the Gnome Stew blog. We'll probably put a link in the show notes. But this article is actually talking about how their premise is that player buy-in trumps GM interest, which isn't really where we're going. But for our purposes, the way they're defining buy-in or player buy-in is the level of excitement your players have about a particular game or setting. The more intense this is, the better your game is going to be. There's just no substitute for stoked players.
Yeah, I think I agree with the sentiment because it is difficult sometimes when your players aren't fully invested in something to try and sell them on a RPG concept. Like this has been my number one, like my go-to issue with getting people to try things that aren't D&D is that people are like, I know D&D, I know what that is. I don't know what this is, and I don't know that I'm necessarily here for the world. And that can be hard sometimes for especially new players, but players that are just like new to the hobby essentially, to be like, oh yeah, we'll try this thing that's not the go-to. And even in the weirder D&D settings, buy-in can be hard. Selling Eberron to somebody can be like, yeah, it's fantasy, but it's not what you think. You know what I mean?
No, yeah, it is. But I think, it to a certain point, I think, their definition of it as far as player excitement is accurate. But I think you brought up, and to go to another monetary term, it is the player investment in the game, so to speak.
Yeah, and with buy-in, it's purely one of those things that is purely subjective, because what I might be interested in and what you might be interested in might be two very different things. Now, I know that we have very similar interests, but as far as maybe a game that I might really love, but you just really don't care about the setting, or you don't care about this feature of it or that. It is your investment and your personal investment into the story, into the world, into the gameplay. I mean, player buy-in, I've been ruined by, if I don't like the gameplay of something, I'll be like, I'm not fully invested into the story because I have to keep playing this game. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I completely understand what you're saying, and I think for me, sometimes that's where I'll fall into the comedy dump, where I just start being a goofball because, well, I'm going to amuse myself, and I don't
Yeah.
do it, I don't think, in a way to be disruptive, but from an outside perspective, maybe it is. I don't know.
I've been with you on those journeys, and I don't think usually you do it to be disruptive. I think usually you're doing it to keep yourself entertained. And that is something that's a little bit different than player buy-in a way. Player buy-in is, in my opinion, the player being fully invested into the story, into the game, into the whatever. What you're doing there, and by keeping yourself entertained, I don't know that that's necessarily buy-in on the world or buy-in on the game. It's more of, I think, just, I don't know. I don't know how to put it.
Self-amusement.
Right, it's
But
self-amusement.
at the same point, I guess maybe that does keep you a little more invested in the game because if you're not latching on to anything else, at least you're keeping yourself present. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, because I've played in RPGs where the players are just like, they're there physically, but they are just not there.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And I think you've played in a couple too, where it's like you sit down at the table and it's normally somebody, I've played with people that normally they're there, normally they're on point, but today, for whatever reason, whether it be outside life stuff or just that they don't care about the story at this point, they're just not there. Like, they're physically at the table, but they're not playing the game. They're not really interacting in the ways that you interact with an RPG. And I get that. I've been there myself. Everybody has where, you feel obligated to play, and you don't want to miss a session, but maybe you have other things going on and that's just what's in your head. And I don't fault anybody, because like I said, I've been there myself. I In my younger days, when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons and bored out of my mind, I would sit and watch the hockey game on my phone while playing D&D.
Jeez.
Well, that was the only game I could get. So I mean, it was what it was, but I'm not proud of that. That's not something that I'm like, oh, yeah, I used to do this. It was just the fact of, and that's another sign of, especially now, if your players are, unless there's somebody who's known to be like constantly on their phone, but if your players are constantly on their phone or constantly like doing other things that aren't interacting with the game, maybe your buy-in's not all there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe it's time to have that conversation at the table and go, hey, is everybody still having fun? Are we still entertained? Or, what's going on? How can we make this better? And I think sometimes, we talk about taking a break when something crazy happens. I think sometimes when the lull in the game starts happening, you need to take a break and go, hey, all right, so I can tell that you guys aren't really fully bought in. What can I do to make that better? What can I do to help get buy-in? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, and it's a weird thing because I think, there's so many factors to it because I think there's the story, there's character, both player character, are you into the character you're playing, but also are there NPCs that in the world that you really like? Like the whole setting could be kind of ho hum, but if there's an NPC or two that you really like, that's something that draws you in.
Oh yeah.
It could be the world, the setting itself, and I think it also, for some people anyway, it can be the game system you're using. But I think most of the time it's some weird stew of all those things.
I completely agree. And again, I think that's, and you can start where your buy-in is really high. And this happens. This happens to everybody. This happens all the time where you'll start a campaign, you'll be really excited to start this campaign, and the first session goes great, and you're excited for that second session. And the second session's awesome. But by session 10, everybody's sitting there going, uh-huh.
Yeah.
So here we are, 10 sessions in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing too, where if you get people like me or maybe you as well, I don't know all of your internal thought processes, but I'll get really, really psyched on a certain game because of the setting or something that, could be nostalgia, could be whatever. And so I'm all excited, but I don't always pay enough attention to if everybody else is not necessarily as excited as I am, but that are they just following along because, "Oh, Steve's excited, so we'll do that because he wants to."
I try to be a little bit conscious of that. It depends. If I'm running the game, I try to be a lot more conscious of that than if I'm just playing. Because if I'm just playing and I'm really digging a game, I'm sorry, but if I'm just playing, I don't have, well, I mean, I have control over the game and the game world, but I don't have control over, other players in the game. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If I'm running a game, I am more conscious about, okay, am I just excited for this or is everybody actually just as excited for this as I am? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I try to run games that if everybody at the table's having fun, that's my ideal game. Obviously as a DM you don't want to just run a game for yourself. I think that can be a trap sometimes because sometimes we get in that mindset of no, I'm just running this for me. And yeah, that's fine, but don't drag people along for that, especially if they're not down for the ride, don't make them you don't have to be like that just because you really want to run a thing. There are other people, there are enough people out there that people in the hobby always looking for games that if you're really 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 determined to run something that maybe your normal table doesn't run, get in one of the discords. There's a ton of great discords with people looking for games. Our discord, there's always people looking for games. If you're a DM and you're willing to run it, you'll find players. If you're a player looking to play something, have you tried DMing?
Well, that's I mean, that's always kind of been a thing with, if you wanna play less common games, sometimes you have to run them.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say it like that, but it's just kind of the way it is that if you're a player and you're running something that's not quite as common, you might be able to find players. That might be something that you can do with no issues. But if not, have you thought about running the game? Have you thought about just picking it up and doing it yourself, And if you run the game, you'll find players. It's always a guarantee that you'll find somebody who wants to play that, but you'll have a hard time finding a DM.
Yeah, yeah. Now, finding people that you can coordinate with time-wise is a whole different kettle of
That's a
fish, but
different beast. And yeah, that's a different beast. But
it's like the old joke about how do you get off a deserted island? Put up an ad that says, "Looking for game, we'll DM."
yeah, it's a joke, but that's the truth is that looking for game will DM you'll bring people. And you know what? Maybe what you'll do, and I've done this myself. Maybe you'll bring people in and be like, "Yeah, I want to play this." And you'll DM for a while and then you'll go, "Okay, what do you guys think of the game?" And the people will be like, "Oh, that's great. I loved it." And maybe one of those people will want to DM the next session, or the next like campaign or whatever.
Yeah.
That can happen a lot. You start out with rotating DMs, and that's something that in my personal gaming career, that's something that I really like because it lets everybody at the table get their chance.
Yeah.
I like playing sometimes. I like DMing, don't get me wrong. I do like to be the DM, but I like to sit down at a table and just play some stuff sometimes. And with that, it's sometimes you just have to eat a little bit of crow and DM for the table.
Yeah, and there are people who honestly prefer to GM over playing.
Yeah,
Takes all kinds.
yeah. So I think we got off onto a tangent, but
It was a related tangent, though.
yeah. um
But
it's at least better than most of our tangents.
yeah, but I mean, like, okay, so to try and circle back in then, okay, let's say you realize you're having a buy-in issue I think maybe do you try and identify what it is, which, I mean, if you've got going back to, our player types episode, which is what, episode 2 or episode 3, I don't know, it's been a while now.
Yeah.
But if you've got primarily social players, maybe all they're there for is kind of hanging around with friends and a little bit of, hack and slash or whatever. And if you're trying to run, the next great long investigative saga, they're just not there for it. And so do you have to I think you have to evaluate what your table's looking for and what you're looking for, but also, I think there are things you can do to increase the buy-in.
Yeah, there are things you can do. I honestly think that when you're evaluating your table, the best way to do that is just to ask.
Yes.
What works for you? What's not working for you? Do you like this part? No. Okay. How do we make that better for you? Just because one player, I don't want to say it like this, and I don't, I'm trying to pick my words very carefully. You can change a whole campaign to fit one player better without hurting the entire table. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can change how things are going to help a player with better engagement to get better buy-in out of them without necessarily ruining the fun for the players that were already engaged
Yeah.
most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest, or I shouldn't say the biggest, maybe the first thing you wanna kinda look out for is that make sure you as the GM keep the whole table involved, at least to
Yeah.
the level they want to be involved. Like, you'll have players, we've seen this at tables that you and I have played at together, where you have someone who's there, they're enjoying it, but they're more watching than actively participating most of the time, but that's how they want it.
Right. That's some players just want to sit back and, play the shadows and just watch the story unfold. And some players want to be active participants. And some players only want to be active participants when it's time for, when things go sideways. And that happens.
Yeah.
That's just how it is.
And I think this again goes back to, like you said, communication and doing that before you even get started and having a conversation, with everybody at the table to go, hey, what do you want? What do you want? Where can we find a good common ground? And that's your session zero, or even, like you mentioned, you can stop mid campaign and, so to speak, have another session zero.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt to take a break and reassess. Just take a stop and be like, what is going on here?
Hmm.
You know, and that doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't hurt anything. You can do it even after a session and just be like, everything good? Are we happy with everything? Is it going in the right direction? Is there something that you're looking for that I'm overlooking? Because I can get tunnel vision. I get tunnel vision myself where I get set on, okay, we're going this way. And my players are like, but what's over there? Oh no, we're going this way. But what's over there? I don't know the answer to that. You know,
Oh, no, I know I can be very tunnel visiony with things. I'm quite aware of that, although I'm usually not aware when it's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I find it important to ask your player. I ask my players after every session, did you have fun? And then B, I will periodically just stop and be like, before we get going tonight, is there anything that I'm missing or anything that you're looking for that I'm not doing? Anything that is there a story beat that I touched on that you're like, you want to go and explore this in this direction?
Mhm.
And I've had players say, "Hey, you'd said about this, but we never really went anywhere with it. Could we maybe do something with that?" Yeah, definitely. You tell me how you want to get there and we'll get there. And it's a matter of just communication really helps player buy-in. I think one of the biggest fails in DMing can be not communicating with your players.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and, like, you're starting to touch into what, my kind of second thought on this is also involving your players in your story, in your world, and Tyler touched on this a bunch last week. We were talking with him, and if you didn't listen last week, he's the GM for What Comes After and Tabletop Tales. That, in his world design, a lot of it came from player ideas that, hey, I want to kind of do this thing. Well, how can we make that work? And so they worked it out together. And you said you do it a lot. I do it a decent amount. He said he does it where the players are brainstorming a thing, like what's going on here, and they come up with an idea, and you just look down and scribble out your note and write in what they just said, because one, you like the idea better, but the other thing that I think that does is, it's one of those things that as people, we like to be right, and we like to think that we figured it out, and it excites us when we find out that we did.
Right. And I hate to say it, I'll do that even if I don't like the idea better, and I'll just figure out how I'm going to make that work for me, or how I'm going to make that work for the story. Even if I don't necessarily like the direction that they want to go in, I don't really like that's fine. Hey, at the end of the day, when you're GMing, it is about having fun, but it's also about making sure everybody else had fun too. And losing sight of that and getting focused on your fun over other people's fun is not it's not the right thing to do, I should say.
Yeah, but I mean, to a certain point, we're all selfish to one extent or another. It's just human
Oh yeah.
nature.
That's true, but it's just you just have to be a little bit more conscious of it.
Yeah, yeah. But I think again, but that's communication is all it really is. But I think, yeah, that, or as a GM, looking at the things that your players seem to latch on to, and including more of that.
Yeah, throwing more of what your players grab onto, throwing more of what your players want to see. And I think one thing that I don't know, I think something that has to be said is not everyone. Okay, so your personal RPG is not necessarily being streamed or played for the world. So you got to think about your audience as the players at the table. And like maybe you do run a stream and that's fine, and so you're trying to be entertaining for what's happening in that stream. But if you're not and you're just playing a private campaign, then focus on the people at the table, because them and yourself are the ones that are the audience for this.
Yeah,
They're the ones that you're trying to keep entertained. They're the ones that you're trying to have fun with, not necessarily, anybody else, not any onlookers necessarily. They're the ones that you're trying to keep engaged.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's, you hit on a point there with the audience thing, and it's, you have to give the audience what they want to keep them excited about the show.
Yeah.
And if I could tangent a little bit here, I've seen Garth Brooks live twice, and I'm not a huge Garth Brooks fan. I'm not even a big country fan as a general rule. But here's what Garth is an amazing showman, just in the first place. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. When I've seen him, he's had recent albums out that didn't really, they're more personal projects that he did because it's what he wanted to do. So out of we'll say a 2-hour set, he does maybe 2 or 3 songs from those albums. And the whole rest of the show is him doing all the classics that the whole arena is singing along with, because he knows that's what they came there for.
I'm just going to ask you something, and I know it's super not on target. Did you see Garth Brooks when he had his Chris Gaines albums out?
No.
Okay, because that would have been like late 90s.
No, I think those were actually while he stopped touring.
Okay.
No, I saw him about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and then
Okay.
again about 4 years ago, I think.
I was just asking because you were talking about Garth Brooks and like his personal stuff, and I'm like, the only thing that I know that Garth Brooks puts out that like isn't typically super popular is when he puts out an album under his, like, I don't know if it's his actual name or what it is, but he puts out those Chris Gaines albums and they're pretty terrible. But anyways.
No, but like I said, it's, he knows what the crowd came to see, and so that's what he's gonna give you. And he's gonna throw in a song or 2 that he wants to do because it means something to him, but most of the show is what the people paid to come see. And to put that into an RPG context, if you're doing the things that you wanna do as a DM and your players don't want that, sooner or later, your players just aren't gonna be there. and the buy-in dropping off is the step before the bodies start not being there too.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. It is just it's one of those things where people just and I've harped on this before, but we've played in sessions where it is mostly the DM just trying to do what the DM wants to do. And everybody at the table's like not in. And
Well, I think maybe that's a trap that particularly newer GMs or DMs fall into, running pre-written material.
I could understand that.
Because, one, you're already kind of nervous because it's not a role that you're comfortable in, and GMing can be very stressful, There's that performance anxiety element to it.
Yeah. I know for myself, yeah, GMing can be very stressful. Like sometimes you just really that's why sometimes when we would play in our personal session, when I'm GMing, I'll just go, "Hey, can somebody do like a one shot or something? I need a break this week."
Mhm.
Like I had a long week. I just need somebody to run something that isn't me so I don't have to. And sometimes that's what it takes. Sometimes you just have to throw it out there and be like, hey, guys, I need a break. I need to step away from myself to keep you involved, to keep everything fresh. Is there anything, we can do, even if it's just sitting down and playing something goofy at the table or, whatever. But
Yeah, sometimes you need that, palate cleanser.
yeah, sometimes you just get it's just too dark, it's too gritty, it's too much.
Yeah, and that's another thing is if the tone that you're going for in a game isn't what other people want in a game, that can be really hard for them to buy in even if they want to enjoy it. And for me, I mean, look, it's no secret, and we talked about it a little bit last. I love horror role-playing games, but I'm not big into horror movies or horror books for the most part. And I know it's kind of strange, but I've also learned that horror role-playing games aren't for everybody.
Yeah, yeah, that's just how it is.
But I mean, like, yeah, it's a weird thing because you do have to, if you're the one GMing, you do have to keep your own interest up. And that would this article that we talked about at the beginning, their whole point really is they have this rather, I mean, it's like a Microsoft Paint illustration, but there's the line of GM interest and player buy-in, and if they're both high, it's awesome. But that doesn't happen very often in the real world. And they have this thing that they're calling the zone of pleasant surprises, which is that point in which, as the GM, you're above the, oh, heck no, I don't want to do that level, but not necessarily by a whole lot, up to where the player's buy in level is what they're calling the zone of pleasant surprises. And it can be really fun.
Yeah, I think that's where I differ, and I don't wanna make it a critique on this what is now 13-year-old blog post. Anyways, yeah, 2008 was 13 years ago. You think about that for a second. Um, Not that I wanna necessarily sit here and make it about this. I super disagree with this old blog post, but I agree with some of the things they said. I have some arguments with the other stuff. I disagree with their little chart of buy-in because I don't know, my personal it's a personal thing. Everybody's a little bit different and I'm down to try anything once.
No, no, I agree with you, and I'm not saying that I think that they're right on, but I think there is some value to going, "Well, I don't hate the idea. Let's try it," and maybe you do find a lot of fun in it, which I think is what you're saying.
Oh yeah, I could understand that. I could understand that. I'm saying a lot more along the lines of their like bottom end of that is no, I won't. And it's like, well, but there's nothing that I would really say no, I won't to. You know what I mean?
Fair.
There's like I've run at this point the only thing I would say no I won't to is D&D and I've run D&D and would run D&D again and probably will run D&D before I die. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like uh, but yeah, player buy-in, it's a very delicate balance.
Mhm.
And making sure your players are invested, making sure that you're invested, making sure that everybody's having a good time. It can be a tough one. And it's something that's one of those things that we talk about and we try and give advice and point you in directions, but if you're new to DMing or GMing, it's going to be one of those things where the only thing that's going to help with your player buy-in and help you make sure your players are having the best game they can is time. And, that's not necessarily the most satisfying answer, but if you're new, it's going to take some time to develop the skills and understand, because we could say these words all day long, but you're not necessarily going to understand what I'm saying when I say, oh yeah, you need to actually take a break and ask the players, hey, what do you like, what do you don't like, and then understanding and comprehending what they're telling you they like and don't like. You know what I mean? I know when I was a new DM, if I'd asked my players, hey, what do you like, what do you don't like, and they'd have told me, I really like this and I don't like that, understanding how to roll that back would have been a very serious challenge for me. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, that's very fair. And I say I had another thought if you're finished up there.
Yeah, pretty much.
And this again goes back to when you're getting ready to start running something is and tying into communication is that you need to have kind of a clear core conceit concept of where you want to go with the game and communicate that to your players so that you both know what you're aiming for. And again, I think this is something where with pre-published campaigns in particular, especially for newer players and GMs, they're like, "Oh, well, we're gonna go have an adventure," and that's as far as they know it. And how do I wanna say this? To a certain point, for me at this point in my life, in my gaming career, I want something more focused than that.
Yeah, and I think with pre-published, one of the things that you need to be aware of with pre-published adventures is please, and I know it's not always possible because time constraints are a thing, please read ahead of where you think your players would be. Please have an understanding before you go into session one, maybe read like half or better than half of that pre-published module. So okay, I know that at the halfway point we're here. Have an understanding of that book. Even though it's pre-written and you're playing out of it, you should still have an understanding of what's coming up, what's coming next, and how to portray that to your players. Because one of the things that can be like, I know DMs want to be surprised as much as players want to be surprised, but planning ahead and reading ahead really makes a big difference.
See, I as a GM, I don't look to be surprised by the story that's in the book, so to speak. I'm looking to be surprised by what the players do and how I've gotta adjust the dance because of it.
See, I agree with that, but one of the things that I've seen and I've done and been in campaigns where this happens, where people will, I don't know, I read like the first like quarter of this, let's go ahead and start running it, and then we get halfway through and they're like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
No, yeah, that you really should avoid that. And I mean, I personal opinion, if you're gonna run something pre-published, read the whole darn thing.
yeah, or at least read ahead of your players, at
Oh,
least.
yes, definitely.
I don't necessarily, I'm not going to tell you to go out there and go crazy, and like, you don't have to read the whole book before you sit down at session 1, but have a good clip of it completed before you sit down at session 1, so you're not running into that point where your players are ahead of you. And if your players start to get to a point where they're going to be ahead of you, wrap the session. Just go, "Hey guys, I haven't read that far ahead. We're going to call it here. I'm going to do some more research. I'm going to read ahead. We're going to be ready for next session, and we're going to pick up from where we left off."
Yeah, because that's a thing I think that will cut into your players' buy-in is if you're stumbling and fumbling because you're caught flat-footed, and
Yeah.
it's going to happen sometimes.
Oh, all the time.
But
Your players are going to do something that you're going to be like, uh, um,
yeah, but that's so to speak, I think to me that's the real trick to learning to GM is getting that sense that that's happening and being able to just sort of run with it, and even if it doesn't really matter to the overall story, run with that because if you run with that, then you can be in the back of your head thinking about what do you need to do for the regular thing. You know what I mean?
yeah, I understand completely. And so I think we're sort of at this point. I think it's time for game of the week.
Game of the week.
Game of the week. Game of the week.
Oh my, that was a mess to get to here, but okay.
Well, you know what?
Uh,
It's a weird topic, but I think it's one that bears thinking about.
yeah, it bears thinking about. All right, on a lighter note, let's get to game of the week.
Alrighty. Well,
What do you got?
I went perusing through my drive-through RPG wish list, which is where I tend to put things that I see and go, "Ooh, maybe I'll use that for game of the week," or maybe I'll use that for game of the week, or someday I'll pick that up just because. So I found this a while back, and I don't remember when, but what I found is a game called Like I Give a Bleep. And that is literally what it is. I'm not censoring for the podcast or whatever. The title of the game is Like I Give a Bleep, and then in parentheses, The Life and Times of a Mad Scientist. What this is a solo game focused on the wild lives of mad scientists and hyper genius adventurers. And so it's just like, to be honest, the title is what struck me. That, and it's all of $3.33. So what
Uh,
do you have to lose?
yeah,
It says, that you can easily play as a straight-laced game of serious ethical considerations as a wild surrealistic comic romp. Okay, they're missing an or. You can easily play as a straight-laced game of serious ethical considerations or as a wild surrealistic comic romp through time and space. Emulate your favorite mad scientist and wild adventurer cartoons, movies, and TV shows. Lean into whatever feel and style you love.
cool. I might have to try that as like a fun thing to play.
Yeah, I mean for $3,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it
$3. That's worth it.
it uses they're calling it the Motif Story Engine, which is a 3D6 resolution system. Yeah, I mean what the heck?
Yeah,
And like I said, the title's what caught my imagination, but the cover art's pretty neat.
cool. All right. So I have one called Paranormal Affairs Canada.
Parano Okay. Hang on. Typey things.
Do you
Okay.
need me to send it over to you?
No, I found it.
Okay. Runs off Fate core system. This is just sort of it's a lot of creatures. It looks like it is a little bit of just weird like Canadian folklore and like that sparkling lakes filled with horned serpents, sprawling forests infested with wendigos, friendly cities hiding vampires, dark gods trying to rise, and it just says welcome to Canada. And I mean, that sounds like a good time. I could probably have some pretty serious fun with this. It doesn't seem too heavy. It doesn't seem too serious. It really seems like it's one of those things where it's just a fun little RPG, or, even if it's just a set of rules for an RPG about the weird mystical things of Canada. If you're into cryptozoology, that's a fun time. I like stuff like that. So
Yeah. Well, you know what, too? And I'm just looking through the profile, the preview. There's the word.
yeah,
But it looks like see,
there's a bit of a book here.
there's 115 pages of bestiary.
Yeah,
So the other thing you could do, and I've heard a lot of people talk really highly of like Monster of the Week and so forth. You could use this as like a bestiary for something like that.
yeah. And the book's only $5. It's 400 or $4.79 in PDF for a bestiary. That's not bad.
Yeah.
For just a list of monsters, that's really not a bad idea. And it is a game. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a game. You can try it. I mean, but
Yeah.
they have rules for characters, they have rules for all kinds of stuff, and it looks like a fun.
I don't see why you couldn't pull a lot of this into like you have that Fate Power Dresden Files.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's sort of why I was looking at it. That's sort of why I was like on my radar. I'm like, I could I have some fate here. I could use a little bit of ooh. So yeah, and if you wanted to play something silly, it's a game called Paranormal Affairs Canada. I'm sure you could dial up the A's and all of that. So
Yeah, the front cover looks kind of comic booky.
yeah,
Like,
but
but you never know. I mean, and just because the game doesn't intend to take itself seriously does not mean that you couldn't have fun doing it that way.
Nope. And that's a lot of games just because they don't Paranoia is I've heard that game played very, very jokingly, and then I've heard that game played super serious. And the game is a little mix of everything, and that's one of those ones where not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be played serious. And that's what this looks like. You could play it serious, you could play it silly, play the game how you want to play it. So
You can play, Dudley Do Right Call of Cthulhu.
oh, that would be fun. Would that not be fun?
Yes, it would. Oh,
Like
like I said,
a Hardy Boys Call of Cthulhu game would be a
yeah, but this looks like a hell of a lot of potentially a hell of a lot of fun anyway.
and it's got a lot of material for $5.
Yeah,
You're talking about like a 300-page book.
it says 219 on the screen, but still, I mean, like I said, I went through the indexes in the preview, and like 115 pages of it is monsters.
Yeah. But with that, we do want to thank you for listening and thank you for coming out. You want to check us out, you can find us on Discord, Me and Steve Talk RPGs, on Twitter at
And RPGs.
and RPGs, Facebook, Me and Steve Talk RPG, or Me and Steve RPG podcast.
Yeah, you could leave us a review on be it Apple or whatever podcast service you
Whatever
use.
podcast service you use. Soon, maybe eventually, I'll just put this out there. I will maybe eventually be posting content myself on TikTok under Me and Steve Talk RPGs, but I don't know what I'm going to be posting there as of yet. I just am working on something.
A maple syrup golem.
Ooh. Sticky.
Um,
It's second edition D&D was great because mimics had this ability called glue, and so you would touch them and they would stick to you.
yeah.
And I just think of that with a maple syrup golem. I think like you take a swing at it and like your sword gets stuck in it, and then like maple syrup oozes down the handle, and now you're stuck to this thing. And you have to you are just now sticky for the rest of the campaign. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Oh,
But that said, if you have something you want to hear us do, swing through the Discord. All the links are in the show notes, or email us, or any of that stuff.
yeah. Come on by our Discord. Seriously, we have a great group of people who hang out in our Discord. Always conversations. You can have talks with, you never know who's going to pop into our show or pop out of our show, and like just all kinds of people, all kinds of cool conversations happening on our Discord at any point.
Occasionally we run like one shots and whatnot, depending on
Yeah.
time and commitments. This past weekend I ran a one shot where I killed all the players. Well, actually I
Yeah.
didn't. They did, but
Delta Green.
Yeah.
So,
but you know what? They all died, but they all had a blast.
well, that's what matters. Is if as long as the players had fun, that's a good goal.
Yep.
But we do want to thank you for coming out, and we want to remind you to be kind to one another and get out there and play some RPGs.
Yep.
Intro and outro music by the band 12 Noon. You can email us at meandsteverpg@gmail.com. You can also find us at facebook.com/meandsteverpg. Thank you, and be kind to each other.
How much for the cigar?
Cigar, $20, dog. You gotta go down the street to the store and buy that.